I'm Bruce Katz, and I applaud all of you for making it through this day, right? These Think Fests, ideas, forums, this is brutal work, right? It is an absolute pleasure to follow Jennifer Bradley. So we co-wrote a book, The Metropolitan Revolution, several years ago. I've got a new book, The New Localism, with Jeremy Nowak. If you were going to write a book, write it with someone. Bottom line, it's too solitary otherwise. And write it with someone who is going to push you and towards really new levels of creativity. So I think what I'm going to talk about today actually sums up, responds to, in some ways counters a lot of what you've heard. Let's just start with this proposition. Everything has changed, right? Economic restructuring, demographic transformation, climate, politics. There's an enormous amount of economic insecurity and cultural anxiety out there because of the pace of change. This is the response, right? Populism, particularly angry populism, particularly populism that is driven by demagogues and narcissists, is the way to exploit grievance. But the grievances are real, and they've been in play for several decades because of globalization. This is the other response. It basically is derivative of the same major economic and social and environmental dynamics, but it's a different way of problem solving. As you've heard many times today, cities are the engines of national economies. They're the centers of global trade and investment. But in this century, they're also the vanguards of problem solving. 20th century problem solving was top-down, driven exclusively by government, particularly national governments, and highly compartmentalized and highly specialized. We taught ourselves that the way to solve a problem was to create a special department, a department of transportation, a department of housing and urban development, a department of education, a department of energy. That was the way the 20th century dealt with problems. The 21st century is bottom up, driven by networks, not by government alone, and intensely interdisciplinary. Because if you're going to solve a problem, and you heard about a lot of solutions today, the way to solve a problem is from multiple sectors, multiple disciplines, multiple leaders and stakeholders at all levels of society, right? You have a traffic congestion, you go to a Department of Transportation, the answer is always widen the road. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you go to a city, there are multiple solutions, multiple ways to get the job done. So if you live in an urban world, what you need are norms and models, right? You don't need rules from the top down because, frankly, they can't quite keep pace with the change. And to a large extent, our national governments have been hijacked by partisanship and contributions. So you need norms and models. And what our book, my book with Jeremy Nowak, was about was trying to look at and find norms of growth, governance, and finance that are emerging in all parts of the world, but particularly in the United States and Europe, and begin to capture and codify them so we can adapt and adopt them at an accelerated pace. So let me just walk through three stories. And I'm going to start with Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is the story of a growth model. It's still playing itself out. It's not yet inclusive. That requires intentionality and purpose. But it is a remarkable story of an older industrial city that used to make things and is now learning to make other things. This is Pittsburgh in 1973. You could barely breathe. I used to come here to see my aunt who lived in Steubenville. I mean, the air was orange. When the steel industry collapsed, this place lost tens of thousands of jobs overnight. It began to see its revival in the 3 Mile Island disaster, which was already mentioned by Rick, because the major companies that owned that facility could not figure out even how to assess the damage, let alone clean it up. How did they figure that out? They went to Red Whittaker, right? For $1.5 million, he and a whole team of roboticists figured out how to create movable robots, right? Because robots at the time, you go to a Ford Motor plant and the robot would stand and would spray paint. That's what robots were in 1979. What they invented were robots that could be moved and controlled. And they figured out the damage, and that was the path to the cleanup. Now, why has Pittsburgh become a playground of innovation? In part, it's because what Jennifer talked about, physical proximity and density of your major anchor institutions. If you go to the Oakland neighborhood today and you go see Carnegie Mellon and you fall out of bed in Carnegie Mellon, you're in Pitt. Think about two world-beating institutions located within a small geography, right? That over decades have continued to receive hundreds and hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in basic science from the national government when it was functional, right? But still, but also from local philanthropies and corporations that help create the ecosystem so you can commercialize the research. You fast forward to today, after 30 or 40 years of investing in the future in centers of excellence in your anchor institutions, you have a first mover position in 5 of the 12 next generation technologies that by 2025 will probably amount to half of global GDP. Any city, any county, any metropolis that wants to basically compete in this century needs to understand how these technologies are going to change our lives and how they can be the foundation of invention and deployment so that it can create jobs, good jobs, quality jobs, not just for the people getting PhDs from Carnegie Mellon or Pitt, for people getting credentials from your high schools, from your community colleges, so that they can begin to participate in this economy. Why Pittsburgh has come back is because this city thinks like a system and acts like an entrepreneur. It doesn't look the way the federal government used to look at issues, in a silo and stovepipe way. It understands the relationship between research and company formation and jobs and skilled workers, and then it takes risk. When these investments were made several decades ago, no one even knew what robotics were, or artificial intelligence, or autonomous vehicles. We didn't even have the language for it. But now you find yourself with a dozen or so other cities at the vanguard of the next century. Several lessons. There are ways to move from being a rust belt to a brain belt. There's a way to build on your historic legacy. And as Jennifer and I used to say, be the best 21st version of yourself. And philanthropic investment in your economy, taking risks, because they can take risk, is really important. So what Heinz has done, and R.K. Mellon, and Hillman have done with your universities is being looked at by every city in the United States and abroad. That's the growth story. The governance story, we go to Indianapolis. Indianapolis in the mid-1970s was completely desolate. All the jobs had left for the suburbs. The fun thing to do in Indianapolis was go downtown with a shotgun, if you owned a shotgun, I suppose, and shoot pigeons, right? You know, Kurt Vonnegut, great novelist, grew up in Indianapolis. He said, what you do in this place is 364 days, you play miniature golf, and then on the last day you go to the Speedway. I mean, this was a boring place. The leaders said, we need to restore the core. Their version of that in the 1970s was to become the amateur sports capital of the world and of the United States. So any sport that was training for the Olympics had to go through Indianapolis first. They built a whole bunch of facilities. They stole the Baltimore Colts from Baltimore. They then stole the NCAA headquarters from Kansas City. And then they woke up and said, how much beer and hot dogs can you consume? Right? Building stadia, subsidizing stadia, doesn't build a next generation economy. Now they did have this Indiana Sports Corporation, which was like a network of public, private, civic, university leaders working together. They then took it and created something called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, which is now a model of a networked entity for cities across the world. They went from basketball to biotech. And the state of Indiana, driven by central Indiana, Indianapolis, is now the second largest exporter of life science products after California. Now, what they did, Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, and continue to do, they did what it took to be the best in what they're good at. They're very good at medical devices. They're very good because of Lilly and Roche Diagnostics and drug discovery. They took every element. Again, they thought like a system. Every element of those sectors, of those clusters, and they basically fed them with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of private and civic dollars so that they could compete. And given their basketball history and sports history, they began to steal faculty from all over the world. Indianapolis is very good at stealing. Here is the lesson. Be an ecosystem rather than an ecosystem. If you go to meetings of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, you're sitting with CEOs, and I know this is going to sound very elite, right? But some group of people need to steer your economy. It's brutal out there, within this country, across the world. You need corporate, civic, university, and public leaders taking responsibility for smart investments, because those investments may not come home to roost for quite some time. And when these individuals in the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership meet, they meet to decide, not to discuss. They're investing back in the Indianapolis ecosystem. So mechanics of collaboration, steering an economy in the 21st century is not a debating society. Every place has distinctive niches and competitive advantages. Put them on steroids. Work at all levels, the neighborhood level, the district level, the downtown level, the city level, the county level, the metro level, the regional level. These economies are integrated across broad geographies. And organized private and civic wealth. We do not have a capital problem in the United States. We have a connection problem. We do not have a capital problem. There's loads of capital. But we now need to connect it, particularly to grow entrepreneurial companies and particularly to grow the talents of skilled workers. Last story, Copenhagen. How many people have been to Copenhagen? Okay, spoiler alert, this is not about cycling. This is about the secret of Copenhagen and why Copenhagen is now the third wealthiest city in the world. So 30 years ago, Copenhagen was flat on its back. 18% unemployment. The city was fiscally bankrupt. The national leaders and the city leaders got together and said, we need to make a bold move. Their bold move circa 1990 was to build a modern subway system. The only question for them is, could they do it without raising taxes? The citizenry was fed up. So they basically came up with a different device to finance infrastructure. And God knows the United States needs to finance infrastructure, right? Here's what they did. They took all the land that the government owned along the harbor in Copenhagen, because the harbor had basically ceased to have any economic raison d'etre. All the port and logistics stuff had moved to southern Sweden. And they took all the land in the Orestad district, which is between the airport and the downtown, which is essentially a military training facility, and they moved it under the control of a publicly owned, privately driven corporation. And what that corporation was told was, go sell the land or lease the land so you can continue to have an equity stake in the value creation, but you can only use the revenue to service the debt on the subway, right? So that's the way we're going to build our subway and finance our subway. There won't be a kroner of taxes, right? It's all going to happen from the government seeing themselves as a real estate corporation and maximizing the value of that for major investments. Think about the United States. What do we need to do? We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in early children. We need childhood. We need to invest in a whole range of things. And the national government is a health insurance company with an army, so they're not coming to the rescue. And states, we don't need to say anything else. It's going to have to happen from this level, and we're going to have to get a hell of a lot more sophisticated about finance. In Copenhagen, and here's their subway system, and other models coming out of Hamburg and Helsinki and Stockholm. It's the Nordics, it's the Northern Europeans who have invented a completely different way of financing their cities. So lessons, they're not there for the quick fix. You go to any American city, what are you doing with the land that you own or the buildings you own? We're selling it off to a developer because we have to meet that year's budget deficit. They're planning for 30 or 50-year growth. And the lessons, they know what they own in Copenhagen. We know what we owe in our cities. Pension fund liabilities, healthcare liabilities, they know what they own. And therein lies the answer. They merged public entities to create this publicly owned, privately driven corporation. And they've created a new kind of public-private. We think of public-private as transactions in the US. They think of them as institutions. We have a lot of learning to do here. A lot of learning. We are behind. We may be the land of capitalism. We're clearly not the land of inclusive capitalism. But we have authorities and entities that were basically created after the Second World War. They need to be retrofitted. They need to be repurposed. They need to be modernized. And we've got to look outside the United States to do that. So let me finish with this, which is how do you build a nation of problem solvers from the bottom up? Because the cavalry is not coming. We all hope, right, that we have some sanity in the 2018 midterms and in the 2020 elections. We all hope for that. But I can guarantee you that the national government in the foreseeable future is not going to make the kind of investments in our future that have to be made. It has to be had at this level. So here's the challenge. For every Pittsburgh, dozens of cities subsidize consumption rather than innovation. For every Indianapolis, yes, we do collaborate, but we don't have these institutions like the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership that can get shit done with large amounts of capital. And for every Copenhagen, we don't even know what we own in the US in government. Because there's so much government, we don't have an integrated, unified, market-making, fiscal creation way of doing things. We have a lot of work to do. So here's what Pittsburgh and the larger Pittsburgh region needs to do. Number one's been done. You know your edge, and others know your edge, because you made 40 years of investments in next-generation technologies that are now just beginning to provide the platform to help the Homewoods and help the Wilkinsburgs if you're intentional about talent and job skilling. So you have a platform now, right? It's to your advantage that Google is here, that Amazon is already here with their R&D, that many others are here. It's to your advantage if you use it. Most cities would die for what you have. So now you have to use it for the next stage. Who's in charge? It's not just the mayor, the county executive, the CEOs of philanthropies and universities and corporations. I mean, it's a much broader network of individuals and stakeholders at multiple levels. Leadership is being defined as cities begin to be the vanguard of problem solving. And where's your power? Cities are not just governments, they're networks, and therefore the whole conversation about, please, sir, give us more from the national government or state government is very limiting. We have to understand the market power of cities, the civic power of cities, and then use it for our own purposes. I think in the next 5 years, we are going to have to create a very different class of city and metropolitan leaders, much more distributed, much more diverse, and as important, a different set of institutions, right? There is only one Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, and there is no city in the United States that has anything even remotely like the Copenhagen City and Port Development Corporation. We have a lot of work to do. I think this day has been an incredible day. I applaud Grant and the whole Heinz team for putting this together. This is a remarkable city. in a country that still has enormous potential. But we are now the problem solvers. And I think this is going to be liberating to a large extent, but unbelievably challenging to us. Thank you very much.